Finally, you've all had to wait a year, but the video you wanted to see is here. In it, we have a Milwaukee impact wrench, which has a long model number, is very expensive, and also has some massive torque numbers. That is going up against the Parkside, the newest high torque they have, the PASSP C4, made by ONEVAN. Depending on the country, the prices are anywhere from 70 up to 140 euros. This thing claims to have nearly the same torque numbers as the Milwaukee. Last but not least, we have an entrant from Aliexpress, in this case the Gisam impact wrench. Prices are anywhere from 50 up to 100 euros. That is depending on the configuration and if it's on sale or not. This thing has the most outrageous torque claims yet at 2,800 Newton meters. An old van, a lorry, and a tractor will provide us with some rusty old nuts and bolts on which we'll conduct some real-world testing. I only have a 5 amp hour battery for the Milwaukee, and we need to somehow bring it in line with the other tools for which I have 4 amp batteries. So as the Milwaukee has a 3/4 inch anvil, it will be using a 1/2 inch adapter. So that means the adapter should lower the Milwaukee's power output by about 20%. Starting with the chunkiest tool here, let's look at the size of these. The new Parkside brushless high torque, it's 20 centimeters long, not counting the anvil, and 9 centimeters at its widest point. As a bare tool, it weighs 3 kilograms. In the middle, we have the Milwaukee, 18 centimeters long and 7 centimeters wide. It weighs nearly 3 kilograms as a bare tool. The smallest tool here is the Gisam, 16 centimeters long and 7 centimeters wide. It also is the lightest of the three at 2.3 kilograms as a bare tool. Regarding Aliexpress tools, an important thing to know is that the weakest part of such a purchase is the battery. They use the cheapest possible cells, and in most cases that is a bad end result, because sometimes the batteries work and sometimes they refuse to cooperate. So the best idea would be to combine an Aliexpress tool with a more decent battery. In my case, that means using an adapter in order to use my Parkside batteries. It's not ideal, but I guess we can't have it all. The first test is M12 bolts, so 90 mm on the van. We'll tighten these to 300 Newton meters and see how the tools handle it. Don't do this at home because this is way above spec for these bolts. First up is the Gisam with the Parkside 4 amp battery. All tools are on maximum settings. Parkside with a 4 amp battery on its most powerful setting. And the Milwaukee with a 5 amp hour battery on its most powerful setting as well. Looks like any of these three is more than sufficient enough if you're just looking to change your car wheels twice per year. Now on to a bigger challenge. We've pulled out the 27mm impact socket for some rusty bolts on a lorry. No torque specs on these, however they should have been appropriately tightened when this was last used. First up, the Gisam with the Aliexpress battery. Looks like another fail there for the Aliexpress discount cells, but just to make sure, back to Parkside power it seems, and let's try the same lug nut. And I think I've just proved my point on the batteries. Now let's use the Milwaukee on its max power setting to tighten things up and have another go. Gisam going first. And now time to see what the Parkside is made of. 4 amp hour battery and maximum power. I also did the test the other way around, but nothing interesting to report, so let's just skip to the more interesting bit, the even rustier rear wheel. Now this should be where the real differences start to be noticed. These are 27mm lug nuts that have not moved in a long time. It's all well and good seeing massive power claims, but old rusty nuts and bolts are where the real test is. So let's get things going with the Milwaukee. Remember, a 5 amp hour battery on this 1/2 inch adapter, which can lose it up to 20% of its power. The Gisam with its own type of
China!
cheap cells, again, cannot do anything but cuddle up in a corner and cry. However, as soon as it sees the Parkside battery, it is happy again. Well, that took a while, but it got there in the end. Back to the Parkside, and as always on maximum power. Now this is where things start to get interesting, because it looks like I managed to come across some really stuck lug nuts, which it could not remove no matter how long I gave it. I tried it with both the 4 and the 8 amp batteries, and in the end the only thing that was achieved was to engage some sort of an overload protection. That only lasted for a couple of seconds, and after that it kept working on just fine. This was the other completely stuck lug nut, but this time we're equipped with the 8 amp battery. Overload protection still kicks in, but there is much more power at hand. By the end of my truly iconic battle for the ages with this lug nut, you will see it has moved a bit. But at that point I realized it was going to strip the thread off it, and that would have been less than ideal. But it still proves that the more power you give this thing, the better it will do. You may not like the overload protection this thing has, however, as a DIY type of tool, I think it is better to have it than not. In the end, managing to move a 27mm lug nut that has not been removed in years is not a small achievement for a tool from a food store. But all of that is still not enough for us, is it? So then, on to the abandoned tractor section of the video. 32mm lug nuts. We have learned everything we needed to from rusty old lug nuts, so in this case, just before trying to remove these, some WD-40 was used. Let's get this party going with the Gisam and an 8 amp hour Parkside battery. I know you can also get these Gisam impact wrenches with a bigger battery from Gisam, however, I doubt it will be a big improvement over the standard one after a couple of charge and discharge cycles. Looking at these 32mm lug nuts, even with some WD-40 on them, you can't say the Gisam did not impress you. As far as I know, these were last tightened to spec and have not been removed for like 10 years. Let's go again, shall we? Not bad. Not bad at all. Now what about the newest high torque from Parkside? It will also be equipped with the 8 amp hour battery, because I think that's how most people will use it. The newest 12 amp battery is a bit much. What are the odds of that? The Parkside finds yet another lug nut which does not want to move. It has to be said the Parkside and Gisam can both come across these sorts of things. However, never had that issue with the Milwaukee, but the price speaks for itself, I guess. This one was also stuck, but not as much. You can hear the thread being stripped if you listen carefully. Let's go from the top this time. Come on, Parkside, show us what you're made of. Now I will show you a couple of more attempts at these 32mm rusty old lug nuts, and you let me know down in the comments how you think each tool did. Before we continue, if you have enjoyed the content so far, you would really help the channel out if you like the video, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment down below. Something really nice on the Milwaukee, which I wish the Parkside had, is that once it gets the nuts loose, it lowers its RPM so as to give you better control. And despite the unfavorable adapter that I'm using, the Milwaukee just feels unstoppable. I don't have the previous Parkside model, which was the B4 by Grizzly. But I have an even older one, the A3, which I have had for more than a year at this point. So let's see how it handles these 32mm lug nuts. Using a 4Ah battery, as usual, settings are turned up to the max. This A3 model has served me well. However, as you'll see later on in the video, there are big differences between this and a new C4. Now on to the final rusty nut, which has stood still for years. It turned out to be a difficult one. So difficult in fact that as soon as it got going, the thread started to go as well. This just shows you how much power is in these things, and you have to be careful, because if this were to happen on a smaller bolt, both Parksides would have snapped it in half. I just thought it was best to leave some thread on the stud. That said, power isn't everything. Now let's have a look inside both of these and see what we find. Also, I've read many complaints about this knocking sound coming from the tool. It can also be heard on this one. This is just the anvil hitting on the hammer because of a lack of grease or lower quality grease. But let's dig deeper than that and see what we find. Before we see the motor, let me explain something. This is roughly what a planetary gearbox mechanism looks like. The part in the middle is called the sun gear, and it drives planetary gears. The gearbox is important to pretty much any power tool because it will convert the high speed of the motor into torque, which is what you need in order to accomplish work. Now we can take a better look at the brushless motor that makes all the magic happen. Notice the helical gear at the front of it. This is not exactly the simple sun gear that I just showed you. This is a really nice touch, Parkside, because that is the same type of gear used in the Milwaukee, but a proper explanation on that a bit later in the video. Now let's see what the hammer assembly looks like. Absolutely massive is the answer, but to me it looks like a bit more grease will do it a big favor. Now have a look at the planetary gear assembly here. Like the sun gear on the motor I showed you earlier, the rest of the gears also have this helical pattern, which is a really good thing indeed. A massive anvil there with what I think is not the best quality grease. And I wonder, why isn't there a 3/4 inch of this yet? Finally, as you would expect, a helical ring gear as well. Now let's see what the Gisam is hiding. This rubber bit around the front is a nice touch I feel, but I doubt they are selling any spare ones. A much smaller brushless motor on this tool, so that's why it gains very little from a huge battery, unlike the Parkside, which wants all the power it can get. Also, the impact assembly is somewhat smaller and lighter. Apart from the motor on the Aliexpress tool being much smaller, do you notice anything else that's different? Yes, that is correct. The planetary gearbox on the Gisam uses much simpler spur gears. These are just straight cut gears that are easier and cheaper to produce. With all of that said, let's get a better look at why you might go for one type of gear over the other. The helical gears used in the Milwaukee and Parkside are more expensive to produce. However, the load on them is gradual, which means a longer service life. They are smoother and quieter. Not really a consideration for an impact tool, but what can you do? And last but probably most important point is that the helical gears can support a much greater load, so no wonder they are the better choice. Here you can see the hammer mechanisms from the Parkside and Gisam side by side. The one on the Parkside is considerably heavier, so couple that with the larger motor on the Parkside and a big battery and you can rest assured the Parkside will have a lot more power than the Gisam. Now, if you're interested in the Parkside tool models and the pricing across countries, I have good news for you. A lovely subscriber shared their project with me that I will link in the video description, a Parkside website which will give you information on models and pricing. This is not sponsored in any way, but since I've used this so many times since I was shown it, I think that you deserve to know of this fantastic work. I know this was meant to be a mainly Parkside test. However, I was really impressed by this. Apart from the battery, that is. The Parkside is more than great value at 70 euros. I think decent at around 100, but if I were somewhere where the Parkside was sold at around the 140 euro mark, and I was looking for a cheap DIY type of high torque, I would seriously consider one of these. An important thing to mention here is that this thing can be sold under several different brand names. Importantly, they are all the same basic tool, so if you fancy this, just look for the cheapest price. But just do yourself a favor, get it as a bare tool, then get an adapter and use it with some decent batteries. As for the new Parkside C4, during the not-so-scientific testing, I felt it was sometimes lacking behind the older A3. When it came to outright power, the A3 just had the edge. However, as I did mention, I don't think that for a cheapish DIY-oriented tool, maximum power is at the top of the priority list. Now let's see the internals of the older A3 version Parkside high torque and decide if the new one is an improvement. We have the new model on the right and the old model on the left. Both versions have massive motors and the electronics, at least to me, look pretty much identical. The hammer mechanisms weigh pretty much the same as well. Note that there is a gasket on the hammer casing of the C4. Such a gasket is non-existent on the A3. But this here I think is the main difference. The new version has the helical gears and the older version is showing its age with its spur gears. I think that with the redesigned gearbox and the overload protection, there is a chance that the new C4 might survive that little bit longer. That said, despite probably voiding the warranty, I did change the grease inside my C4. However, the differences don't end there. The new version has yet another surprise for us. If you are an IT specialist and you go into the little home app, you must keep calm and carry on through all the updates and failed connections. You end up at the settings for these impact wrenches. The older A3 is pretty basic, not much going on really. However, the new C4 has an expert mode. For me, this was a huge battle and I never got it to work properly. Even during use, it would revert back to some basic settings. However, in the brief moments when I got it to work in expert mode, I did feel a power increase over its otherwise highest mode 3. I am showing you the expert mode with a 4 amp battery because I never actually managed to get it going with my slightly older 8 amp batteries. And even after that, I still maintain the A3 feels just a bit stronger than the C4. That is just a gut feeling and not much more than that. However, if you manage to get the expert mode on the C4 going, it does become the harder hitting impact wrench indeed. So the bottom line is, I think if the price is right for you, the new version Parkside Performance High Torque Impact Wrench will not disappoint you. So, what do you think then? I know everyone wants the Milwaukee, but how about these three? Which one would you pick and why? Let me know down in the comments.